Hello and good afternoon. I'm Steve Goodman, and I am talking to you this afternoon about how to keep teams under control without holding back your workforce. So, as the last few of you join, I'll just make a couple of you an attendee. There we go. So if you've got any questions, raise your hands as we go through, and we can allow you to unmute and, of course, come back and answer any questions as well at the end. A little bit about me. First of all, I work at a company in the UK called Content and Cloud as principal technology strategist, about 50% hands-on with customers. Still, for my sins, working on projects including Exchange projects, but also on newer stuff like Teams as well, helping our customers deploy those, both on some of the technical side, but also on the user adoption side as well. I've been lucky enough to speak at conferences like Ignite, and last time I was over there, got to share a car with Drago, who's the organizer of today's conference, which is great fun, and of course tune into his podcast if you want to hear us driving around the streets of Orlando. I'm also host of the All About 365 podcast and the Practical 365 podcast with Jason Wynn and Paul Robershaw, respectively. So tune into those as well if you love your podcasts. I also write for Practical 365 and Petri.com, and I'm co-chief editor on Practical 365 as well. You can follow me on Twitter at Steve Goodman. So in today's session, we're going to talk about how Microsoft groups fit into Microsoft Teams and the importance of good governance, because there's lots of different models that you could choose to manage teams in your organization. And whilst there's loads of different ways to achieve this, a self-service model generally works well, but really won't work unless you've got the right guide rails in place. So we'll talk about how you can control the group creation process if you want to put some limits on that. And of course, how you can make sure that people don't go and name teams whatever they like, and how we can keep that sprawl at bay as well. We'll talk about some of the newer features that have arrived in Teams over the last month, including Teams templates, and how do we manage Teams access and guest access as well. So we'll talk about all of those all important topics over the next half an hour to 45 minutes. So first of all, how does Microsoft 365 Groups fit into Microsoft Teams? So Groups itself is a wonderful concept that Microsoft came up with, I think now 4 years ago, to be called Office 365 Groups. And when it was Office 365 Groups, it started with technologies like Outlook and SharePoint. And what Office 365 Groups, when it first came out, enabled us to do was create a membership list and then provision access to various different services. And this became the underpinnings that Microsoft Teams grew from. And you'll see today that new functionality comes to Microsoft 365 Groups, even as recently as this last week, where if you go into OneDrive today and create a new shared folder, it creates a group. So it's really important that when you're looking to govern collaboration, you don't just think about Teams, but you think about Microsoft Groups and all the areas that it gets its hooks into. Now, Microsoft 365 Groups has these entry points like SharePoint, OneDrive, Outlook, Planner, Stream, Yammer, and all of these fit directly into Microsoft 365 Groups and Azure Active Directory. So we end up with a membership list with owners, members, and guests inside that as well. And it works in an interesting way where if we go and create a new team, then Microsoft Teams enables us to see that almost immediately. So within this loosely coupled set of services, Teams will create that team. But if you use Teams yourself, you've probably seen if you go straight away to things like the Files tab, that it still thinks it's getting things ready. So it does work where it notifies Microsoft 365 Groups what it's done. That then goes and creates the group within Azure Active Directory, which then goes and provisions into all those other services. However, Teams also gives notifications to those services, letting it know what's happened, so you don't have to wait for that replication. So we've got that process where these loosely coupled services enable us to go and create a new group within those individual services. And then as your AD, make sure that all of these things match in the background, and then each individual service manages provisioning their services as they go. So when a team gets created, what do we get? So creating a new team creates a new group, a new Microsoft 365 group, which creates us a hidden shared inbox. So if you've seen Outlook groups, then it does create the fundamentals of that. There's a shared calendar as well, which you can choose if you like to enable. It creates as a new SharePoint site collection with a document library in it as well. And a lot of people do say, you know, Teams is a service that sits on top of SharePoint, and that is true. You can't do a lot of things inside Teams, like share files, collaborate together, without SharePoint. So it is fundamental for that. It also creates as a shared OneNote notebook inside that site collection, and we get that persistent chat-based workspace as well. And then after this gets synced, then when we make these changes, adding the group. So if we go into Outlook, if we go into the Microsoft 365 portal, if we go into the SharePoint site and change group memberships, then that replicates across as well. And if we want to try and add our users to these, then things like adding groups to groups, we could in Active Directory, doesn't work in quite the same way, but we can add things like distribution lists to a group to expand that as well. Or we can use dynamic groups, which is a premium feature. If you're trying to get on top of governance for groups, then you want to start at the beginning. What I've seen perhaps more than ever over the last 6 months is that people have just let loose with Microsoft Teams, or they've thrown themselves into Microsoft 365. And I was on a call this morning, and we were talking about a tenant migration, and the customer with about 5,000 people in the organization had hundreds and hundreds of groups. I think they said something like 900, and the organization they were acquiring had just 5. It's only less than 100 people, so understandable. But they were shocked at how few. And there's a difference really, between having too few and having too many. And we've seen a lot of organizations where they are just shocked at how many 900 teams is that a lot, even for an organization with 3,000 or 4,000 people. That's one team for every 5 people, at least. And in some cases that can be even more. I've seen organizations where we've got 2,000 people and 1,000 teams, or organizations that have just allowed users to go and create teams, and they've got many thousands that are unused, or they're being used for the wrong thing. They've got users who are just using Teams as a place where they dump files. They've not really thought about governance. And then over the last 6 months, when they've just had to launch into Teams, they've just had to get it out there, then they're now going back to try and put some of this governance in place. And I tell you, it is much more difficult to implement the governance aspects after you've got hundreds and hundreds of teams in your organization than it would have been to plan that governance and get it right from the start. So usually if I'm working with a customer and we are planning this out before we jump into Teams, or before we start allowing people to create teams, then we want to plan out this model for group provisioning and have a life cycle as well. And we want to know whether the data that's going to be sitting in these needs protection as well. And some of the sessions earlier today talked about using sensitivity labels, and that can be crucial for some customers. But fundamentally, we want to decide what our model is for provisioning. Will users be allowed to go and create teams for themselves? Will they have to request it from IT? Or will it just be certain people that will be able to do it? And what happens with those groups? How will we review those on an ongoing basis? And if we are allowing people to do this, are we going to have to go back and review these over time, or are we going to put a model in place that's going to manage that for us? And really, the best thing we can do as IT pros is not take on even more work. We've taken on Microsoft 365 with its ever expanding set of services. The best thing we can do is try and make sure that as we implement new technologies, then we do our best to try and make them self-managing. And that might be custom provisioning tooling, or it might be, as I'm talking about today, really using the tools that we get within the service to allow this to manage itself and keep things easy for users as well. So a typical Microsoft recommended life cycle is going to be beginning with self-service provisioning. One thing that is going to delight the people in your organization, the people who are paying for this, for their company, is going to be able to decide on that day that they need a new team for the project that they're working on. And it can be extremely frustrating as a user who knows how teams work, who's went through all the training and understands what its purpose is. If they can't use Teams, they will find another way. If they need to work on a project together very quickly with a group of people and you don't have self-service provisioning in place, they'll either use another tool or they'll use group chats and share files out of their OneDrive. They'll do things a different way. So we need to make sure that whatever we're using to allow people to request groups is done in the right way and it's communicated effectively, whether that is only allowing team leaders to go and create teams, so that if you have a lot of field workers, then only the line managers are going and creating teams, for example, or allowing everybody to do it, or using more advanced tooling like custom provisioning tools to allow for a full workflow engine to be able to approve or deny team creation. And then in the service itself, we want to be able to have policies that deal with the whole expiry, retention and deletion. We want that life cycle to manage itself. So we want to make sure that over time, if a team is set up for perhaps the sales team are doing a bid, it's unsuccessful, but they created a team for it, that this team will, of its own accord, expire out through lack of use. And that is very important to have in place. Otherwise, you will end up with hundreds upon hundreds of teams within the organization. And unless you are monitoring the group usage, you are looking for the teams that are no longer used. And then yourself, contacting users and saying, is this team used anymore? I'm going to delete it. Then, perhaps they won't be sure, can't remember when they last used it, eventually deleting those set of teams or deleting them and telling people, going back, making up your own way of working, then you won't really go very wrong by using some of the built-in tools that enable it to have a look, see whether a team is used. When it stops being used, start the trigger on that so it counts down until deletion, notifies users, and then gets rid of it as well. And we also want to have a look at how we can rationalize the groups in use, because Microsoft 365 groups, of course, allows people to start, as I said, from different places. And ideally, we don't want them to go and create planner and create a new planner for the thing that they're working on, and then create a separate new team for the thing that they're working on, and then create a new SharePoint site collection tied to an Office 365 group as well. We want them to use really one group that contains that common set of members, owners, potentially guests as well, and have it tied into all of those services. And that's going to help people keep the sprawl under control. And it's also really something that's going to mean that people won't get confused because they won't be managing separate sets of memberships. So we've got different options when we enable self-service. The first one, and this is Microsoft's recommendation, to be transparent. Many customers don't just use self-service. They will go with probably the second one on the list, which is limiting the self-service to a subset of users, at least as they begin their journey into Microsoft 365. And enabling self-service for everyone, it is the Microsoft recommendation. But it requires you to trust the people in the business to make the right decisions. And giving that control over to people who, without the right training, without the right knowledge, without understanding why the tools are in place, and then expecting them to know the right decisions without the right knowledge, might not be the right thing to do, at least initially. You might need some time to make sure that you've been able to provide the right communications, you've been able to set teams up in the right way so it maps to different parts of the business and how they can use the tools before you enable people to get at it and do as they like. The best thing you can do, though, when you've got self-service in place is have those governance rules up front, so people effectively enter into this self-service relationship with that contract with IT, effectively, that says, I am allowed to create things by myself, and when I stop using them, they will disappear from the service. And of course, it avoids what I see at some customers where they've limited this strictly down to IT service desk staff, help desk staff, project teams for teams, where they're the gatekeepers for access to teams. And that becomes a frustration for them because they're constantly, as the momentum grows with teams, they're having to be the gatekeeper to enable people to use the tools the right way. And of course, if you've done nothing to set the service up the right way, and you're constantly creating teams, you're thinking about the user's use case, you're creating a curated, bespoke team for them, you're guiding them through their first experience as they onboard, that will soon overwhelm you with additional work. So again, putting that work into the planning, the comms, the governance is definitely worthwhile. Limiting self-service to a subset of users can have a long-term use case as well. You know, if you have a business that has a large majority of lower level or lower skilled users who are effectively going in there to perform specific tasks, but they are not managing teams, they are not managing departments, they are not managing the data that they work on, then you might want to limit self-service. And that could be limiting it to a very wide set of users. It could be all of your information workers are allowed to create teams, but if you have delivery drivers on your staff, perhaps they won't be allowed to do the same thing, and that might be left to their line managers. So we can do that. You know, we can limit it, but also for the people that are going to be big teams users, we can make sure that limiting self-service is still for the kind of people that are going to be using these tools, effectively open to all of those people as well. And one thing that I see at my customers, so a large majority of my customers are larger enterprises, and they will have been on Teams. You know, the type I'm talking about now will have been on Teams for 1 or 2 years now. So when they started on their journey with Teams, there weren't things available in the service that were easily exposed to users, like templates. So to curate an experience for users and make sure it followed a specific set of business rules, it meant that we would need to provide our own custom code that might set up a SharePoint site collection the right way, that it might create the particular channels via the Graph APIs and load in the specific applications, post messages into the teams to explain how the team would be used, and front that with a custom portal that would guide the person to the right experience. And even today in large organizations, some of the cool new stuff that's came to Teams is new, and it's great that Microsoft have released it early, but it doesn't perhaps cater for every single use case. If you're in an organization with 10,000, 50,000 or 100,000 people, and different parts of the business, different business units had different ways of working, then actually we might want to drive them to a particular portal within the Teams user interface that is a custom provisioning portal that shows them and explains to them the particular templates that we've created for them, rather than giving them the option of seeing all of the templates that the organization has and Microsoft's own recommendations as well. So it enables us to guide that experience, but it works, best in larger organizations. In smaller organizations, with, under 1,000 people, larger organizations that have a high proportion of information workers, then really we do want to go into those top 2 use cases where ideally we're driving people for self-service, but we're also putting those guide rails in place. So the controls that we've got when we're putting those guide rails in place involve the following. We'll go into some of these in a few moments. So we've got naming policies. We've got group creation controls, who can or can't create groups. We've also got group classifications, so we can classify the groups as well. Generally, though, you'll be led, as you probably should be, towards using activity labels that can now be applied to teams as well. But these controls rely very, very heavily upon the licensing that you've got. And if you are perhaps using the Office 365 E1 6-month trial, you're just coming to the end of that, for example, or you're using, just Office 365 E1, E3, F1, then sometimes you don't have these additional pieces of functionality available because they do come with particular licenses. So stuff that we want to be able to do, like templates, core access, being able to recover deleted groups, these come as part of every Office 365 E1, E3, E5 subscription. They also come with the Microsoft 365 Business Basic, Business Standard tools as well. If we want to be able to apply some of these controls, such as group creation controls, naming policies, classifications, dynamic group memberships, apart from company-wide teams, and importantly, applying expiration, access reviews, then we do need additional functionality. And the core set of functionality is included in Azure AD Premium Plan 1. The access reviews at the bottom, which enables us to regularly see whether the right people are in particular teams, is part of Plan 2. So if you've got Microsoft 365 E3 licensing, then you'll have Azure AD Premium Plan 1. If you've got EMS E3, then you'll have Plan 1. If you've got Microsoft 365 Business Premium, then you'll have these Plan 1 licenses as well. Access reviews will be part of either that standalone plan or EMS E5 or Microsoft 365 E5 plans. And as you can see, if we want to be able to do additional things in terms of security and compliance, then these fit across the EMS and Office 365 suites as well. So Microsoft 365 E5 is going to give you everything. Microsoft 365 E3 is going to give you most things. Key things that you will want are things like DLP for your files. You will also probably want hold and discovery and retention, and they come as part of Office 365 E3. DLP, however, for Microsoft Teams, so to make sure that should you have guests in the organization or you have people that might send sensitive information like credit card numbers over chat messages, and you want to block that sensitive information from either escaping the business or going between colleagues, then you'll need Office 365 E5, all advanced compliance add-ons on the top. So licensing remains, a bit of a pain. But if you're doing as many customers do and going for something like Business Premium, or you're going for M365 E3, then you'll have the core set of tools that you need to be able to enable all of this self-service stuff to work really well. So assuming we've got these, then we want to govern the creation process. So why would we do that? We want to be able to limit that to certain roles in the business and ensure only certain people can do this. Now, this doesn't prevent the use of these. If we block this entirely and we don't allow anybody to create groups, then admins can still go into the service and then go and create that. So if I'm a global admin, a GA in the service, then I can go into the Microsoft 365 admin portal. I can go create groups. I can create teams as a team service administrator. If you can, and you've got it available, then try and use dynamic membership as well. You know, if you're going to control the group creation process, you're going to create teams for departments, then use dynamic membership to remove that admin overhead, where you can pick something such as the department name inside Azure AD to govern who's going to be a part of that team. And if you are going to control this, revisit it later on. You know, as I said, some organizations at the beginning of their journey, creation of groups, companies I've worked with over the last 6 months, as I say, they may have started with teams for just meetings. They may have limited the creation of groups until around about now when they start to put the right controls and governance in place. If we want to be able to do this, then the first place we need to go is Azure PowerShell. So we can use Azure AD PowerShell to go in and create an object that has the template for what somebody that can create a team looks like, and that will have the object ID of the group or the groups, the security groups that will be allowed to go and create those groups. So we create a group in the portal, we add our members, the people that will be able to create teams, create Microsoft 365 groups, and then we perform this configuration. We stamp this to Azure Active Directory to say who can and can't do this. And of course, this does mean that you need Azure AD Premium Plan 1 licenses. I'm not a licensing expert, but off the top of my head, I believe that is for everybody that's a group creator, rather than just the admin that goes and makes that change themselves. So next, managing naming for Microsoft 365 groups. Now, why would you do this? It's good for consistency. So if we want to try and make sure that ad hoc groups or groups that are for departments are all named in a consistent way, then we can do so. We can also make sure that particular words, for example, if we don't want somebody to create something called marketing or use particular customer names or swear words, things like that, we can block certain words, and we can make sure that we've got particular strings or attributes acting as a prefix or a suffix. Now, if you don't need them, then don't use them. If you are going to use them with teams, then absolutely make sure that you don't use them as a prefix, because there's nothing worse than a long prefix showing in Teams on the left-hand side. Because if, for example, the prefix was the department name and it is perhaps 20 long, and somebody in a department created 3 or 4 teams, it would be difficult for them to identify which one of those was their team, the one that they created, because of those prefixes. So use it at the end so it can easily be identified, searched for, viewed as an administrator, but it won't impede upon the experience inside Teams itself. Keep it short if you can. Do not try and fill up the whole 264 characters. And of course, use attributes in Azure AD to fill these in. That will make things a lot easier for you. As I say, department codes are a great way of being able to see whose teams these are, who created them as well. It's fairly straightforward to set up. We can do that in the Azure AD Admin Center. So you'll find this under the Azure Active Directory Admin Center in the portal, and you'll find this under the groups under naming policy. In the naming policy, we can set this up either with the block words on the left-hand side, or we can set the group naming policy in there. And as you can see in this, I've got an attribute set for the department that will add that to the end of all of the groups that people create. So if a department is set, it will add that to all new teams. Our block word list, this is something that we can upload as a CSV file with a maximum of 5,000 to our tenant. And again, this is if we want to make sure that particular reserved words that might be sensitive or important to teams like our sales teams, marketing teams, where they don't want somebody to use that organization wide without asking first, are blocked. Or if we want to try and make sure that any profanities is not used as well, or rude or unwanted slang. So expiration policies are great for keeping the team sprawl at bay. So first of all, it is aimed at being a set it and forget it feature. So we can auto renew groups based on their activity, and we fire groups after they've been inactive for a certain period of time. And as I mentioned earlier, this isn't something that silently acts in the background. When this is in effect, if somebody doesn't use a team for some time, but they do want to keep the information, then they'll get a notification. So I gave you an example before of somebody that created perhaps a team for a bid in their sales team, and perhaps it hasn't been used for 6 months, but they spent a lot of time and effort creating that, and they thought, well, if I need it, I'll come back to it. They will get a notification saying, do you want to keep this team? If they choose to keep it, renewing it, or it might give them a wanted reminder so they can download the content that they want from that team, perhaps that proposal or sales deck. They can download that to their OneDrive or perhaps to the right place in a SharePoint document library, and then let the team expire. So it doesn't create a case where users will be likely to come back and say, hold on, what's happened? I've lost all this data. They will have been notified. Now, the guidance for starting with this is not to just switch it and see what happens. We can pilot this with specific groups to start with. We can look at the reports for inactive groups and determine which of those groups we can target as well. So we can follow that up. We can create targeted communications for those people. Of course, those communications will be your responsibility to create. So you can say, we're piloting group expiry. Your groups have been inactive for a certain amount of time. You will start to get notifications telling you that these will be deleted. If you see the notification, make sure you follow these actions, otherwise the groups will be deleted. And then we can see, based on the feedback from users, how well that works. And also, as part of this, we might want to make sure that if you have a high turnover of staff, that we're managing groups properly as well. So we want to make sure that groups have multiple owners. A good key governance item for managing teams is making sure that we identify 0 owner teams on a regular basis, but also teams with just the one owner, because a team with one owner does mean that if somebody is working on something important, gets run over by a bus, then that information could get lost and could eventually get deleted if somebody hasn't came and found that information before they returned from sick leave. So let's have a look at how we set this up. And as you can see, we've got some safeguards in here. If we go into expiration, you'll see we can set up a group lifetime. So in this example, 180 days is set. And for groups with no owners, we can set a contact address, which could be your normal email address inside your tenant. And then we can pick those pilot groups before we select that for all of our groups here. So we can choose selected and then go down and pick the different groups that we want to pilot this on and send those particular communications out to. Now, one of the most exciting things that has came out this year and will have recently arrived inside your tenant is the Teams templates. And Teams templates are different to the ability to create a template, I think in XML format, and upload that as an administrator or via Graph APIs. This is aimed at something that's really useful for the people, the users in your organization. So first of all, this gives us those signposts to guiding the right sort of usage. So we can make our pre-approved, predefined Teams templates based on those use cases that we define. So if there are, as I said, bid teams or project teams in the organization, we know those should look like. We've defined perhaps a common template structure of channels and tabs, applications that will be added to those. Then we can make sure that things are always created that way. The Teams templates will create all of the channels we want, add in all the apps to that team based on what we define in that template. If we've got practices that are already working as well, it's quite easy to onboard the Teams templates, because a little bit like the functionality that allows you to copy a team, it allows us to, through the Teams admin center, copy a team into a template. So we can template our existing common use cases that work well, that we've experimented with within the business, and onboard those into our library of templates that will be available for users. And to get started, and you may have seen this already, Microsoft provide a whole bunch of their own templates that can't be disabled, unfortunately, at the moment at least. And those can be a good starting point for people to use alongside our custom templates. Now, its capabilities are likely, like everything in Teams, to improve over time. So at the moment, what this is doing is replicating the structure. So it's making sure that our users don't have to try and figure out their own way time and time again. This does mean that if there's a particular set of document templates that are critical, or there's a particular website that should always be added, like a bids portal, to go back to that example, then that must be performed. They'll be guided, the placeholder will be there, but they'll have to perform some additional actions to make that happen. And if we're thinking of all of these different possibilities that we might see in our organization, then we do want to try and limit that to what is really going to be appropriate. So a bit like things like sensitivity labels, retention policies, DLP policies, where we never want too many. At the moment with Teams templates, we don't want too many either, because we risk confusing people. So we can't curate what people will see. We can't assign right now a template to a particular group of users so that the sales team see the sales templates, the professional services team see all the professional services templates, or the first line workers, retail, see a store template or a promotion template. They'll see all of our core templates. If we are going to hide this from users using our custom provisioning engines that you may have, that I talked about earlier, then there is good news there, because we can still use these Teams templates, and then we can ask our developer who is building our custom provisioning API, or our third-party partner or vendor that provides those tools, to use the Graph API to then pick that particular template or expose that template in our custom portal. But at the moment, that kind of stuff needs to be done outside of this. However, those templates can be stored within Teams. And this looks great, all right? So if you haven't seen this already, take a look, and you'll see in the Teams Admin Center, in the tab, this is under Teams, and you'll see your normal facilities for managing Teams, and you'll see Teams templates. And under here, we've got all of the standard ones that are built into the service by Microsoft. And then we've got the option to add new ones as well. And this gives us, simple set of options: creating a brand new template from blank, use an existing template, or use an existing team. And you can see here what I've done is chosen one of my existing project teams. That's set up, it works really well, it's got all of the right channels in, and I've used that as my starting point. Once that's brought in, then we might need to again go and add additional things to it. So even when we copy in a team and it brings in the channels, or if we start from scratch, we'll still need to look at each of those channels and then add and rename the particular applications that we want. So for example, if we want to bring Microsoft lists into it, then we can give that tab a name of asset list. If we want to add a planner to that, we can call that project plan. If we want to add a particular SharePoint site or a SharePoint page, we can do so. So for example, if there's an expectation that this will always show an FAQ, for example, then we can do that. Now, once we've created those templates, then you'll see these in the normal Teams creation under Join or Create a Team. And you'll see the familiar from scratch or from a group or team. And then beneath this, you'll see the templates. And it starts with our templates that we've created. So I've got department team and standard project team in the list. And then you'll see these ones where, unfortunately, Microsoft are allowed at the moment, not us, to give them fancy logos. So you'll see some for adoption of Office 365, for example, in that list. And the user will have our custom templates listed first. Once those are created, then they take a little while to wear away behind the scenes while the team is provisioned. So the team will slowly provision these and create all of the channels and then add all of those particular tabs. If, for example, we've added something like our FAQ as a website, then when we first visit that, for example, you can see event news, then it will give us the ability to then go and set up that tab. We'll have to do that manually. We can't, for example, set in the template at the moment the URL that should go to. So that is a little bit of a limitation when it comes to adding in SharePoint sites, existing plans, existing lists that might have key information. It does mean that it's not perfect yet, but it's giving all of those right guide rails, as I said before, to the user, so it makes it easier for them to get started. So just quickly then, if we're looking at that access model for Teams, what we want to make sure we do is keep this as simple as possible. We don't want to encourage or allow users to go and start making their own custom permissions within Teams. So we don't want them to go and create separate folder permissions. We don't want them to go and manage the memberships or share files, particularly outside of that. The best thing we can do is keep this as simple as possible. So when it comes to things like adding members or adding permissions to the team, always encourage users to use the tools built in as team owners that they've got to add members to a team, rather than granting them manual access to things like SharePoint sites. And if they want to provide more granular access, then that's when they should start to use things like private channels to be able to give a subset of data access to different people. And of course, that'll keep that very much in line with channel permissions as well as things like file permissions as well. So everything sticks together, as best as possible. So the place they should be looking at is that members tab here. So I'm going to finish off with guest access in Teams, and guest access is a session in itself, but I want to talk about the basics that you need to consider. So, why should you use guests? Guests are perfect if you're working with external partners, external parties, and you're working on a project together. We don't need them to chat between organizations, and we don't need them for meetings. However, they do rely upon the common settings across Microsoft 365. So we need to set up controls in a variety of different areas for this to work. When we add a guest, that creates an Azure AD guest account for that user that maps back to their identity. It does mean that we can retain control over things like conditional access. So if we require conditional access in our tenant, but they don't in the source tenant where they're logging into, we can enforce those additional controls when they enter our boundary. The guest capabilities are different to a normal team member. So they can do things if you want, like create channels, participate in private chats and so on. But you've got the ability as a team owner to restrict what they can do. For example, if we don't want them to create channels, we don't want them to delete or edit posted messages. Our core central controls for this are Azure Active Directory. So we can decide what types of roles can invite people in. So the guest inviter role is a key one that many organizations will use to determine who will be allowed to invite guests into particular teams. The default settings will allow members, so people within your organization, not administrators, to invite people into teams as well. And that does mean a user in any team by default could invite a guest. And we can define how wide these collaboration requests can be sent. So we can restrict that to certain partners. So if we work closely with another organization, then we can say it's fine for anybody to invite anybody from contoso.com into our tenant. We also need to set these settings for Microsoft 365 groups as well. So once we've set it at the Azure AD level, we'll also need to configure this for Microsoft 365 groups and of course Teams as well. So we need to go through all the way down through Teams and down to SharePoint as well. If our settings across these services don't match and they're more restrictive in one place than another, then people will get a broken experience. What some organizations do for particular sensitive teams where you may allow guest access for the rest of your organization, but there's certain things like exec teams that you don't want guests to be able to be added to, then you can use PowerShell to block access for adding groups, for adding guests to certain groups. So to finish off, groups and teams are absolutely interwoven. So good governance for Microsoft 365 groups enables good governance for teams. Aim for self-service where you can. It is the best experience for users. It will make them happiest. If you do need to restrict it, then consider where you're going to restrict it to. Information workers who good comms has shown them how best to use the service are probably the kind of people that should definitely retain self-service access to create teams. Naming policies, keep them simple. Expiration policies, use them to keep on top of sprawl. And start using Teams templates so you've got those guide rails to show people quite easily how to use the service in the right way. And of course, guest access isn't just about Teams, it's about those other services as well. Thanks for listening today. I'm Steve Goodman, and of course you can follow me at Steve Goodman on Twitter. I'll be around for a couple more minutes. I'm currently looking after a child who's home from school due to coronavirus, so they might come in once I stop talking. So if you hear some noise in the background, I apologise in advance. But thank you very much for listening to me today.